The wedding dress was her mother's final gift, white cotton sewn with pearl buttons that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Clara Bell pressed the gold locket against her palm as the black wall of death thundered through Willow Crossing. At midnight, the tiny photograph inside her mother's gentle face, now her only shield against a marriage that promised nothing but brutality and slow destruction. The flood roared like Satan's own hounds. Clara's ribs screamed with each breath. 3 bones cracked during Marcus Voss's wedding gift, a preview of their honeymoon that had left her spitting blood into her bridal bouquet. As the icy torrent slammed her against splintered cottonwood, she watched the locket slip through her desperate fingers into the churning darkness, taking with it the last trace of love she'd ever known. "Forgive me, Mama," she whispered as she stumbled into the muddy water, its taste bitter with sorrow and lost hopes. Clara's heart ached with the thought that escaping this fate was her only mercy. Better to preserve her soul than live as Marcus's plaything. Then iron-strong hands seized her wrists. A shadow cut through the murderous current, pulling her toward shore with impossible strength. Through the haze of near death, Clara glimpsed copper skin and war-braided hair, a Comanche warrior who should have let her drown but chose salvation over survival. His angular face, marked by old pain but lit with unexpected grace, was the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her completely. When fever finally broke its hold 8 days later, Clara found herself cocooned in buffalo hide inside a shelter of bent willow and deerskin. Sage smoke and wood fire scent filled the air, and golden sunlight filtered through the entrance like hope made visible. Her body felt trampled by wild horses' ribs, tender as fresh bruises, throat raw as scraped leather hands, wrapped in soft strips that smelled of healing herb. An elderly Comanche woman sat grinding medicine's gray braids adorned with eagle feathers and movements carrying the precision of someone who'd spent decades mending the broken. This had to be White Raven, whose gentle touch had kept Clara alive through fever dreams that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. "Water." Clara croaked, her voice barely human. White Raven spoke rapid Comanche to someone outside. Moments later, the warrior who'd saved her ducked through the entrance, carrying a water skin and strips of dried meat. His presence filled the small space with quiet strength that reminded Clara of towering oaks, weathering endless storms. Nashoba stood tall for a Comanche, broad-shouldered and marked by old battles. Silver scars traced his left arm like ancient script, and his weathered face spoke of a man who'd seen hell but refused to let it break him. When he knelt to offer water, Clara noticed his hands calloused from hard living but gentle as they supported her aching head. "Your husband," Clara whispered after drinking deeply. "Drowned. Found his body downriver, caught in a deadfall." Clara waited for grief or relief to wash over her, but felt only hollow numbness. Marcus had been cruel before their vows, his fists leaving promises of worse to come. The terror in her eyes stemmed from more than floodwater. White Raven spoke urgently to her nephew, her tone heavy with unspoken warnings. Nashoba's jaw tightened as he translated, "She says your spirit was wounded long before the water tried to claim you. That you carry scars no flood could make." Clara pulled the hide closer armor against unwanted truth. "Why save me?" "Because you were drowning. That's all." Nashoba studied her with dark eyes that held echoes of their own suffering. "My grandmother taught me that every life carries medicine for the world, even when we can't see it ourselves." For 6 days, Clara tested his patience like a trapped animal checking cage bars. She refused food claiming poison. She questioned his motives, accused him of keeping her for unspeakable purposes. When strength returned, she tried fleeing in pre-dawn darkness, only to collapse beside a creek when infection overwhelmed her stubborn will. Nashoba found her there as sunrise painted the hills molten gold, carrying her back without reproach or anger. His silence cut deeper than any lecture, and Clara began understanding she faced a man whose capacity for grace exceeded anything her 19 years of hard living had shown her possible. The wild boar that charged from the brush 3 days later finally shattered every defense she'd built. Clara was gathering kindling when the massive creature exploded from the undergrowth, tusks gleaming like ivory daggers and eyes wild with territorial rage. She stumbled backward, too weak to run, watching death approach on 4 thundering hooves. Then Nashoba's war cry split the morning air as he threw himself between predator and prey, taking the boar's tusks in his side rather than let them reach Clara. His hunting knife found the beast's heart, but not before blood soaked his shirt and pain turned his face gray as winter sky. Clara pressed cloth against his wounds with trembling hands, finally understanding what manner of man chose protection over self-preservation for a woman he barely knew. "Why?" she whispered as firelight flickered across his pale features. "Because kindness is all we have left against the darkness," he said through gritted teeth. That night, as Nashoba slept fitfully, and White Raven chanted healing songs that seemed to call spirits from the very air, Clara made a decision that would bind their fates together like braided rope. Chief Tall Elk's displeasure was carved in granite as he stood before Nashoba's shelter 3 days later. The war chief commanded respect at 60, his chest scarred from Sundance ceremonies, and his presence radiating the authority of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions since boyhood. "You endanger us all, nephew," Tall Elk said in careful English that carried the weight of absolute judgment. "The whites will come for her like wolves following blood scent. They always do." Nashoba, still pale from his wounds, but standing ramrod straight, met his chief's gaze without flinching. "She has nowhere else to go. No one else to protect her. Then let her find the grave that calls to her. We cannot afford a white woman's troubles when winter approaches and the cavalry grows bold." The tribal council that followed split like lightning-struck wood voices rising around the central fire like wind through canyon walls. Some warriors saw Clara as a curse, a pale harbinger of cavalry raids and broken treaties. Others, led by White Raven's quiet but iron-strong influence, argued for compassion in a world that offered precious little of it to anyone. The deadlock shattered when little spotted deer fell sick with fever and shaking fits that sent his mother into wailing despair. Medicine men chanted urgent prayers to spirits who seemed deaf to suffering, while the boy's temperature climbed toward death's threshold. Clara approached White Raven quietly, her movements careful not to attract attention from those who already viewed her with suspicion, bordering on hatred. "Let me help," she said simply. "My mother taught me things about healing." For 3 days and nights, Clara sat beside the sick child, feeding him sips of willow bark tea and keeping his fever down with cool, damp cloths. She sang half-remembered lullabies her mother had whispered during her own childhood illnesses, her voice soft and strange in the Comanche camp, but somehow soothing to the suffering boy. When Spotted Deer's fever finally broke and he asked for food with the imperious hunger of a healthy child, even the most suspicious tribal members began seeing Clara through different eyes. She wasn't just a white woman anymore. She was a healer who'd saved one of their own. That evening, as celebration fires burned low and the camp settled into peaceful sleep, Clara found Nashoba sitting alone beside the river. Moonlight turned the flowing water to liquid silver, and the night air carried wild rose scent mixed with possibilities neither of them dared name aloud. "Your people still don't trust me," Clara said, settling beside him on the grass that whispered secrets to the wind. "Trust takes time, especially for people who've been betrayed as often as mine have been." Clara watched the water flow toward distant seas, carrying away the day's sorrows and tomorrow's fears. A night bird called with lonely wildness that echoed something deep in her own heart. "I've been thinking about what you said. About kindness being all we have left. Yes, maybe survival is another kind of kindness. Maybe 2 broken people can survive better together than apart." Nashoba turned to study her face in the moonlight, and Clara felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against her soul. "What are you saying, Clara Bell?" She took a breath that tasted of sage and courage she'd never known she possessed. If you're willing, and if your people will accept it, maybe we could choose each other. Not from fear or desperation, but because we've both lost everything once, and don't have to be alone in the darkness anymore." Silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. When Nashoba finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You know what such a choice means. The whites will call you traitor and worse. My people already whisper that I've forgotten my place in the world. I stopped caring what others think the night I nearly drowned," Clara said with fierce conviction. "All I care about now is finding a place where kindness isn't a luxury we can't afford." 3 days later, as dawn painted the eastern hills in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Clara of her mother's favorite quilt, she and Nashoba stood beside the same river where she'd first spoken of choices and survival. White Raven had woven sweet grass into Clara's hair and painted protective symbols on Nashoba's chest with clay and charcoal ancient marks speaking of new beginnings and hope against overwhelming odds. The ceremony was simple, but profound as mountain thunder. They spoke vows in both English and Comanche, their words witnessed by flowing water and endless sky that had seen countless loves bloom and wither across the centuries. Clara wore a dress of soft deerskin that White Raven had sewn with countless tiny shell beads, and around her throat hung a necklace of turquoise and silver, a wedding gift from women who'd once viewed her with suspicion, but now offered their protection. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Clara thought she'd finally found sanctuary from the world's cruelty. She was wrong. Harlan Slade collected pain like other men collected coins, and he was exceptionally good at his bloody business. Tall and lean as a starved wolf, with pale eyes that seemed to see straight through skin, to the fear trembling beneath, he'd been tracking Clara Bell for 3 weeks across 2 territories. The bounty on her head was substantial $500 for her return to face charges of murdering a sheriff's deputy, plus whatever additional rewards Marcus Voss was willing to pay for his runaway bride. Marcus Voss rode with Slade's gang, now his survival from the flood, a cruel joke played by a river that should have claimed him. He'd clung to a barn roof for 6 hours, listening to his neighbor's death screams and feeding his rage with elaborate fantasies of what he'd do to Clara when he finally got his hands on her again. The bruises he'd given her on their wedding night were just an appetizer for the feast of pain he had planned. The lie about Clara murdering Deputy Carson was Voss's masterstroke, a crime serious enough to justify any violence used in her capture. In territories where justice was whatever the man with the most guns decided it should be, accusations carried the full weight of conviction. They struck like lightning at sunset on the 3rd day of Clara and Nashoba's marriage, when the camp was relaxed and unprepared for the hell that was about to rain down upon them. Clara was washing clothes in the stream when the thunder of hooves shattered the evening peace like glass. Rifles cracked like breaking bones, and bullets sent splinters flying from trees around the village in a deadly wooden rain. Nashoba's warning shout reached her just as she dropped the wet clothes and ran for shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ah, Clara Bell." Voss's voice cut through the chaos like a rusty blade. "Come out and face what you've done, you murdering whore." Nashoba appeared at her side with a rifle in his hands, and death burning in his eyes like cold fire. "We run. Now. North toward the canyon country before they surround us completely." But Tall Elk had different plans. The war chief stepped into the open with his hands raised, but his voice carrying absolute authority despite the weapons trained on his chest. "This is Comanche land. You have no legal business here." Slade's laugh was like the sound of bones snapping under a boot heel. "Legals, whatever I say, it is, Chief. You're harboring a fugitive from justice, which makes you all accessories to murder." The negotiation that followed was brief and brutal as winter wind. Slade demanded Clara's immediate surrender in exchange for leaving the village unharmed and unburned. Tall Elk, his weathered face impassive as carved stone, translated the terms to his people, while tension stretched like a rope about to snap. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken calculations and the bitter mathematics of survival. White Raven broke the deadlock by stepping forward despite her age, her back straight as an arrow shaft, and speaking directly to Slade in careful but clear English that carried the dignity of ancient wisdom. "The woman you seek is no longer here. She died in the flood with her husband. We have only mourned her passing and honored her spirit's journey." Voss snarled like a rabid dog and raised his pistol toward the old woman's heart. But Slade caught his wrist with casual strength that spoke of long practice in controlling violent men. "That's a touching story, grandmother." Slade said, his pale eyes studying White Raven with the attention of a predator evaluating prey. "But I've got witnesses who saw your boy there, pulling a white woman from the water. Yellow hair, blue eyes, about 19 years old. Ring any bells in that wrinkled head of yours?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until one of Slade's men, drunk on whiskey and the promise of violence, made a fatal mistake. He fired a shot that sent splinters flying from a shelter where children were hiding, their terrified screams piercing the air like arrows. The Comanche warriors already wound tight as coiled springs responded with war cries that had chilled white blood for generations, and arrows that found their marks with deadly precision born of a lifetime's practice. In the chaos that erupted like hellfire, Nashoba grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her through the maze of burning shelters and screaming people toward where their horses were tethered. Behind them, the battle raged, with the fury of all the broken promises and stolen land that lay between their peoples, rifles against bows, desperation against determination, the future against the past. Flames began licking at the night sky as they mounted and rode hard toward the northern hills, pushing their horses to the very edge of endurance across country that grew steadily more rugged and unforgiving with each mile. The acrid smoke of burning homes followed them like a curse, and Clara's guilt rode heavy on her shoulders as she realized that once again innocent people were paying the price for her very existence. By dawn, they were deep in the canyon lands, where red stone walls rose like ancient fortresses, and water was more precious than gold or silver. Behind them, Slade's surviving men followed with the patient persistence of wolves tracking wounded deer across endless miles of broken country. The pursuit that followed lasted 6 hellish days across terrain that seemed designed by God himself to kill the unwary and punish the desperate. They traveled by moonlight when possible, and hid in caves during the scorching heat of day, their horses' hooves wrapped in strips of cloth to muffle the sound of their passage. Water became their most precious possession, rationed drop by precious drop, and food was whatever they could catch or find growing wild among the rocks. On the 3rd day, their luck briefly turned when they encountered unexpected allies, a family of runaway slaves making their own desperate journey toward Mexico and the promise of freedom. Moses was a big man, with gentle hands, deadly aim, with the old rifle he carried like a trusted friend. His wife Ruth had eyes that had seen too much suffering, but still held hope like a candle flame in darkness. And their young son Samuel possessed the quiet courage of someone who had never known safety but refused to surrender to despair. "We all got the same devil chasing us," Moses said as they shared a meager meal around a carefully hidden fire that barely gave off enough light to see each other's faces. "Different names maybe, but same devil all the same. We gotta watch out for each other, 'cause ain't nobody else gonna do it for us." For 2 precious days, their unlikely alliance held strong against the world's cruelty. Moses knew the country well from his own flight toward freedom, and his steady presence helped ease the constant tension of being hunted like animals. But on the 5th day, Slade's men caught up with them at a waterhole near the Mexican border, and their brief respite from fear shattered in gunfire and screaming. The fight was brief and vicious as a wildcat in a trap. Moses died with his rifle smoking in his hands, having bought the others precious seconds to escape with his own blood. Ruth grabbed Samuel and vanished into the maze of canyons like smoke on the wind, following secret trails that Moses had mapped for them in whispered conversations around their hidden campfires. Clara's last sight of them was Ruth's determined face as she led her son toward whatever freedom might await beyond the border, carrying Moses' memory like a torch in the darkness. Nashoba took a bullet in the shoulder during the fight, and Clara collected a graze across her ribs that left her shirt bloody, and her breathing labored like a bellows with a hole in it. They stumbled through the desert, like walking corpses sustained only by the kind of stubborn will that keeps people alive when all reason says they should lie down and die. Salvation came in the form of a small Mexican mission, its adobe walls glowing pink as sunrise in the setting sun. Father Miguel was a young priest with kind eyes and steel in his spine when it came to protecting those who sought sanctuary within his walls. He hid Clara and Nashoba in the mission's root cellar, while Slade and his remaining men searched the building above, with increasing frustration and barely contained violence. "There is no woman here," Father Miguel told the bounty hunters in careful English that betrayed only the slightest accent. "Only prayer and the peace that comes from serving the Almighty God." Slade's boots creaked ominously on the wooden floor directly above Clara's head as he ransacked the priest's modest quarters with methodical thoroughness. She pressed her face against Nashoba's chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady despite his wounds, and tried not to think about what would happen if they were discovered in their hiding place. "You're lying through your teeth, priest," Slade growled with barely contained fury. "I can smell their fear like blood in the water." "Then perhaps you should examine your own conscience," Father Miguel replied with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize evil when it stood before him. "Fear has a way of following those who create it wherever they go." The search lasted an eternity compressed into a single hour of breathless terror. When the hoofbeats finally faded into the distance, like thunder moving away from a storm, Clara and Nashoba emerged from their hiding place like creatures crawling from their own graves. Father Miguel tended their wounds with gentle efficiency, his medical knowledge evident in every careful stitch and clean bandage he applied. "You cannot stay here long," he warned as he worked his voice heavy with regret. "Men like that always return when their pride has been wounded. You have perhaps a day before they realize I was telling them the truth about what I knew, but not the whole truth about what I suspected." They left the mission before dawn, broke over the mountains, carrying food and water that Father Miguel insisted was a gift from God rather than charity from man. Clara wanted to offer payment for his kindness, but the priest simply smiled and made the sign of the cross over them both with hands that had blessed the dying and comforted the grieving. "Vaya con Dios," he said softly as they mounted their horses. "Go with God, and may He protect you from those who have forgotten how to love." But sanctuary was nothing more than a dangerous illusion in country where men like Slade made law with gun barrels and enforced it with rope and fire. 3 days after leaving the mission's protection, Clara and Nashoba were finally run to ground at a trading post called Fort Dawson, a collection of weathered buildings surrounding a dusty square, where justice was whatever the local sheriff decided it should be, and mercy was a luxury that cost more than most could afford. Sheriff Briggs was a fat man with small, mean eyes, and a badge that Slade had probably purchased for him with blood money. He took one look at the wanted poster that Voss thrust under his bulbous nose, and decided that Clara Bell was guilty of whatever crimes would bring the most profit and cause the least trouble for his own corrupt hide. Murdered a deputy in Willow Crossing. Briggs declared loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear every damning word. Shot him down in cold blood, then corrupted herself with this savage buck like some kind of animal. That's 2 kinds of hanging offense in any civilized territory. Clara found herself locked in a wooden cage behind the trading post, like a dangerous animal, while Nashoba was beaten unconscious by Slade's men and chained in the stable like property to be sold at auction. Voss stood outside her cage with malicious satisfaction gleaming in his eyes, like lamplight reflected off a snake's scales, finally having cornered the prey that had eluded him for so long. "Thought you were real clever, didn't you?" He sneered, his voice dripping with the promise of unspeakable retribution. "Running off with your red nigger buck like some kind of romantic story. But you're still my wife, in the eyes of God, and law and death won't part us until I say it can." Clara wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to summon the courage that had carried her this far through hell and high water. Around the trading post, men were already discussing the best way to hang a white woman who had forgotten her proper place in the world's natural order. Some advocated burning her alive as a lesson to others. Others preferred the traditional rope as being more civilized. All agreed that an example needed to be made for the sake of public morality. But help was already riding hard toward Fort Dawson, carrying evidence that would change everything and turn the hunters into the hunted. White Raven had survived the attack on the village, though barely, and she carried with her proof of Marcus Voss's true nature a letter written in his own hand to a woman named Ellen Cartwright, and a gold wedding ring that told a story of bigamy and very likely murder. The old medicine woman had spent weeks tracking down the truth, like a bloodhound, following a scent, following a trail that led to a saloon in El Paso, where a drunk cowboy had let slip that Marcus Voss had been married before to a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances, just 1 month before Voss set his sights on Clara like a vulture spotting carrion. White Raven's arrival at Fort Dawson caused quite a stir among men who had never seen a Comanche woman ride boldly into their midst with the bearing of royalty and the determination of divine justice. Behind her came 2 unexpected allies. Father Miguel from the mission, whose conscience had finally compelled him to speak truth to power, and Circuit Judge Jesse Crawford, whose reputation for honest justice was legendary enough in territories where law was usually purchased by the highest bidder. But there was more to Father Miguel's presence than simple conscience. As White Raven spoke with Judge Crawford in urgent whispers, a terrible truth emerged. The priest had indeed helped Clara and Nashoba. But he had also sent word to local authorities about their presence, hoping to protect his mission from retaliation. His arrival now was as much penance as it was assistance, a man seeking redemption for a choice that had haunted him since they'd ridden away into danger. Crawford took one look at the circumstances of Clara's capture and demanded a proper hearing rather than the lynch mob that Sheriff Briggs had been organizing for the entertainment of the local citizenry. The trial began at noon in the trading post's main room, with every available chair and barrel pressed into service for the curious crowd that had gathered to watch justice in action, or at least what passed for justice, in their corner of hell. Clara sat beside a nervous young lawyer that Crawford had appointed from among the few men present who could read and write with any competency, while Voss and Slade lounged at the prosecutor's table like cats who had cornered particularly tasty mice and were savoring the moment before the kill. Sheriff Briggs presented the case against Clara with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, painting her as a cold-blooded murderer and a traitor to her race who had killed an innocent lawman and then fled to live in sin and degradation with a savage. This woman has violated every law of God and man. Briggs thundered, pointing an accusing finger at Clara like an Old Testament prophet denouncing sin. She's forgotten her Christian duty and embraced the darkness of heathen ways. Only death can cleanse such corruption from our midst and restore proper order to the world. Voss took the witness stand next, his performance polished and persuasive, as he painted himself as a grieving husband seeking justice for his murdered bride and vindication for his wounded honor. His voice cracked with practiced emotion as he described finding Clara's empty room the morning after their wedding, and the blood on the floor that he claimed came from Deputy Carson's death wound, and the missing pistol from his gun belt that had supposedly done the deadly deed. She shot that poor boy down in cold blood. Voss lied with the smooth conviction of long practice. I saw the whole thing with my own eyes. Deputy Carson was just trying to help her with her wedding dress when she turned on him like a snake and put a bullet right through his heart. Then she ran off with that Indian buck, laughing about what she'd done like it was some kind of joke. But Slade grew dangerously overconfident during his own testimony, unable to resist bragging about his skills as a tracker, and the clever way he had followed Clara's trail across 3 territories like a bloodhound following a scent. His pale eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure as he described the hunt in loving detail, savoring each moment of fear and desperation he had witnessed. "Took me 6 weeks to run them down," he boasted to the fascinated crowd. "But I always get my quarry in the end, no matter how far they run or how well they think they can hide. Dead or alive, they all come back with me eventually." That was when Judge Crawford asked the question that began unraveling their carefully constructed web of lies. Like pulling a single thread from a tapestry, "And what exactly is your legal authority for pursuing alleged fugitives across territorial boundaries, Mr. Slade?" The silence that followed was deafening as a thunderclap. Slade's confident smirk faded like smoke in wind as he realized his fatal mistake. Bounty hunting without proper legal authority was itself a serious crime, and kidnapping carried penalties that could stretch a man's neck just as surely as murder. Crawford's weathered face showed no emotion as he examined the legal documents that Slade reluctantly produced, with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. "These warrants are issued by Sheriff Briggs, I see, but they're dated after Mrs. Bell's capture, not before it. That makes your entire pursuit illegal from the very beginning, regardless of any other considerations." The courtroom erupted in angry mutters and confused questions as the implications of Crawford's words sank in like stones thrown into still water. Voss leaped to his feet with rage flushing his face purple. But Crawford's gavel restored order with sharp authority that brooked no argument from any quarter. "Furthermore," the judge continued in a voice cold as winter wind, "I find it extraordinarily curious that no one in this courtroom can produce the body of this murdered deputy, or even verify that such a person ever existed in any official capacity. Sheriff Briggs, do you happen to have Deputy Carson's employment records available for examination?" Briggs stammered and shuffled through papers that clearly contained nothing more useful than yesterday's dinner menu. "Records were all destroyed in the flood, Your Honor, but everyone in town knows. What everyone knows is often quite different from what everyone can prove in a court of law." Crawford interrupted with the patience of a man who had seen every variety of corruption and incompetence that frontier justice could produce. "Mrs. Bell, you may now present your defense against these charges." Clara's young lawyer, his hands shaking with nervousness, but his voice growing stronger with each word, called Father Miguel first to testify. The priest spoke eloquently about Clara's character and the genuine kindness she had shown to strangers in need, his testimony carrying weight, even among men who rarely saw the inside of a church and had little use for sermons about Christian charity. But when Father Miguel finished his testimony, he remained standing in the witness box, his face pale with the weight of confession that could no longer be contained. "There is something else I must say," he declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtroom. "I helped this woman and her husband when they sought sanctuary at my mission. But I also sent word to the territorial authorities about their presence, hoping to protect my congregation from retaliation. I thought I was choosing the lesser evil, but I see now that I was simply choosing evil itself." The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Clara felt the betrayal like a physical blow, but before she could fully process it, Crawford was questioning her about the night of the flood, with the gentle persistence of a man who believed in truth over convenience. Clara's testimony was simple and devastating. In its obvious honesty, she had been in her room at the boarding house preparing for a wedding night. She dreaded more than death itself when the water came without warning, like the wrath of an angry god. There had been no deputy, no murder, no flight from justice, only a desperate fight for survival against nature's fury and human cruelty. And your relationship with the Comanche man called Nashoba? Crawford asked with careful gentleness. Clara lifted her chin, her voice clear and strong, despite everything she had endured in recent weeks. He saved my life when I was drowning in that flood. He cared for me when I was injured and had nowhere else to turn. He protected me from wild animals and violent men who wanted to use me for their own purposes. We were married according to Comanche custom because we chose each other freely, not from fear or desperation, but from genuine love and respect. Did he ever force himself upon you in any way, ever cause you harm or distress? Never, Clara said with absolute conviction. He's the first man who ever treated me with genuine kindness and respect, who saw me as a human being rather than property to be owned and used. That was when White Raven stood up in the back of the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate attention despite her small stature and advanced age. The old medicine woman walked slowly forward, her beaded dress rustling with each deliberate step, carrying a small leather pouch that seemed to glow with inner significance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "I have something that must be shown," she said in careful English, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with the authority of absolute truth. From the pouch, she drew 2 items that would change everything and turn the trial on its head: a gold wedding ring set with a small but genuine diamond, and a letter written on expensive paper in flowing script that spoke of education and refinement. Judge Crawford examined both items carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as their implications became clear as mountain spring water. "This ring," White Raven explained with the quiet dignity of someone who had never learned to lie, belonged to Ellen Cartwright. She was Marcus Voss's first wife, legally married before God and man. This letter is his promise to marry her and be faithful until death should part them. But she died under circumstances that were never properly investigated exactly 1 month before he married Clara Bell. The courtroom exploded in shocked voices and angry accusations that rose like steam from a boiling pot. Voss lurched to his feet with his face white as bone and rage burning in his eyes, like hellfire pointing a shaking finger at White Raven, as if he could will her out of existence through pure hatred. That's nothing but lies and Indian witchcraft," he snarled with spittle flying from his lips. "Made-up stories and forged documents designed to protect a murderer." But Crawford was already reading the letter aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed room, and its contents were damning beyond any possible dispute. Voss had written to Ellen Cartwright with the same false promises and honeyed words he had later used to deceive Clara: a comfortable home, financial security, a respectable marriage that would lift her above her humble circumstances. The letter was signed with his distinctive flourish and dated just 3 months before Clara's wedding, making his second marriage illegal under the laws of God and man. "This evidence strongly suggests that you were already legally married when you wed Mrs. Bell." Crawford said, his voice cold as winter wind howling through canyon walls. "That would make your second marriage fraudulent from the very beginning, and Mrs. Bell an innocent victim of deliberate deception rather than a willing participant in any crime." Voss's carefully constructed mask finally slipped completely, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface. His face twisted with raw hatred as he looked from Clara to White Raven, to the judge who was systematically destroying his lies with nothing more than truth and proper legal procedure. "She belongs to me," he screamed like a man possessed by demons, spittle flying from his lips in his fury. "I bought her fair and square from her worthless father, paid good money for her, and she owes me what I purchased. She owes me a wedding night, and by God Almighty, I'm going to collect every penny's worth." The ugly truth hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre, poisoning everything it touched. Clara's marriage to Voss had never been a union of hearts, or even a practical arrangement between equals. It had been nothing more than a financial transaction, her father trading his daughter's freedom and body for 30 pieces of silver and the promise of whiskey money. The realization sent murmurs of sympathy through the crowd, like ripples on water. Even frontier men who had seen every variety of human depravity had mothers and daughters and sisters they cared about. And the idea of selling a child into what amounted to slavery struck them as crossing a line that separated civilization from barbarism. Crawford's gavel banged repeatedly as he fought to restore order to his courtroom, his face showing the strain of a man who had spent his entire career trying to impose justice on a world that seemed determined to resist it at every turn. "Mr. Voss, you will sit down immediately and remain silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom and held in contempt of court with penalties to follow." But Voss was far beyond reason now, his rage finally breaking free of all the restraints that civilization and self-interest had placed upon it. He pulled a small derringer from his vest pocket, with hands that shook with fury and desperation, pointing it directly at Clara's heart with the clear intention of ending her life, rather than losing possession of what he considered his rightful property. "If I can't have her, then nobody can," he snarled with the voice of madness itself. That was when Slade made his own fatal mistake. The bounty hunter, seeing his payday disappearing along with any hope of legal protection for his crimes, drew his own pistol and aimed it directly at Judge Crawford's head with the cold calculation of a man who had nothing left to lose. "This whole damn trial is over right now," he announced with deadly calm. "I'm taking the woman and collecting my money, and anyone who tries to stop me is going to join that imaginary deputy in hell." The trading post erupted in chaos as some men dove for cover, while others reached for their own weapons, the civilized veneer of legal proceedings dissolving like sugar in rain. In the confusion, someone Father Miguel, seeking redemption for his earlier betrayal, had managed to unlock Nashoba's chains and guide him toward the courtroom, despite his injuries and the armed men who should have been guarding him. Crawford showed the kind of courage that had made him legendary throughout the territory, standing slowly and facing Slade's gun, without so much as a tremor in his weathered hands. "Sir, you are threatening an officer of the territorial court. That is a capital offense under federal law. Federal law don't mean shit out here in the real world." Slade snarled, his pale eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. "Money talks louder than law, and bullets talk loudest of all." "Perhaps they do," came a quiet voice from the courtroom doorway, cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. "But some bullets speak with more authority than others." Nashoba stood framed in the entrance like an avenging angel, a borrowed rifle steady in his hands despite the beating he'd endured. His face was battered and swollen from Slade's fists, but his aim was rock steady, and his dark eyes burned with the kind of righteous fury that had made his people legendary warriors for centuries. Behind him, Clara could see Father Miguel and several townsmen, who had apparently decided that kidnapping, bigamy, and threatening a federal judge were crimes worth risking their lives to stop. The standoff lasted for heartbeats that felt like hours, with death hanging in the air like the scent of gunpowder before the storm breaks. Slade's pale eyes flicked between Nashoba's rifle and Crawford's impassive face, calculating odds and escape routes with the desperate intelligence of a predator who suddenly found himself facing bigger predators. "Drop the weapons," Crawford said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had stared down death more times than he could count. "Both of you. There has been enough violence and bloodshed for one day." Instead of complying, Slade spun like a striking rattlesnake and fired at Nashoba, his shot going wild in his haste and splintering wood from the doorframe in a shower of deadly splinters. Nashoba's return shot was calm, measured, and absolutely final. It took the bounty hunter square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward across the prosecutor's table with blood spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. Voss screamed in incoherent rage and swung his derringer toward Nashoba, but Clara was already moving with the speed of absolute desperation. She threw herself sideways, knocking over her chair, and feeling Voss's bullet burn past her ear, close enough to singe her hair and leave her temporarily deaf on one side. Before Voss could fire again, 3 different townsmen tackled him to the ground with the righteous fury of men who had finally witnessed one atrocity too many. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving him pinned beneath their weight and weeping like a child, calling for his mother with the pathetic desperation of a man whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of his own evil. Judge Crawford stood over the wreckage of his courtroom with disgust written plainly on his weathered features, but also with satisfaction that justice had finally been served, even if it had required violence to achieve it. "Nor, Marcus Voss," Crawford said with formal dignity, "you are under arrest for bigamy, fraud, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder. Sheriff Briggs, if you have any sense left in that thick skull of yours, you will lock this man up securely before these good people decide to dispense their own brand of frontier justice." But even as legal victory was finally achieved, it came at a terrible cost that would haunt Clara for the rest of her days. White Raven suddenly collapsed to the floor, her hand pressed to her chest, where blood was spreading across her beaded dress like a crimson flower blooming in the desert. Slade's wild shot had found an unintended target, and the old medicine woman who had sacrificed everything to save them was dying on the courtroom floor. Clara and Nashoba knelt beside her, Clara's hands pressing desperately against the wound, while Nashoba spoke urgent words in Comanche that seemed to give White Raven strength for a few more precious moments. The old woman's eyes were growing dim, but she managed to press something into Clara's palm, the turquoise and silver necklace from their wedding day, still warm with the heat of her body and the love of her spirit. "Keep it close to your heart," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the chaos surrounding them. "Remember always that love is stronger than hate, even when the whole world says otherwise. Make our sacrifice mean something." Judge Crawford quickly gavelled the trial to a close, declaring Clara innocent of all charges and issuing federal warrants for the arrest of everyone who had participated in her illegal capture and persecution. But even as justice was finally served and vindication achieved, Clara felt the bitter weight of its cost pressing down on her heart like a gravestone. Outside the trading post, a crowd was gathering, with the dangerous energy of men who felt cheated of their expected entertainment. Word had spread through the settlement that the Indian woman who had exposed Marcus Voss's lies was dying, and some of the local residents thought that was one redskin too many in their town for comfort. The mood was turning ugly with the kind of mob mentality that had fueled countless lynchings across the frontier, and Clara could see their future written in the angry faces pressed against the windows. "We need to leave this place," Nashoba said quietly, his arm around Clara's waist as they watched White Raven's labored breathing grow weaker with each passing moment. "Right now, before this crowd decides that legal justice wasn't nearly enough satisfaction for their bloodlust." Father Miguel approached them with saddled horses and supplies, his face grim with the understanding of what was coming and heavy with guilt for his role in bringing them to this point. "The nearest mission with real sanctuary is 40 miles south across dangerous country. Tell them I sent you, and they will give you protection until you can reach the Mexican border safely." Crawford overheard their conversation and shook his head with the frustration of a man who had spent his entire life trying to impose civilized order on an uncivilized world. "You shouldn't have to run from here. The law has cleared you of all charges, and you have every right to go wherever you please as free citizens. Law and justice ain't always the same thing, Your Honor," Clara said quietly, echoing words her father had spoken during one of his few moments of wisdom. "Sometimes survival matters more than being right, and sometimes being alive is more important than being vindicated." They rode out of Fort Dawson as the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed to prophesy the violence they were leaving behind. White Raven's body was wrapped in her finest blanket and secured to a travois that bumped and swayed behind Nashoba's horse like a funeral procession crossing the gates of hell. The old woman had insisted on coming with them, even in death, her spirit needing to find proper rest in the sacred burial grounds of her people, far from the hatred and ignorance that had claimed her life in the service of love and justice. The journey that followed tested Clara and Nashoba in ways that their previous ordeals had never approached. They traveled by night across country that grew steadily more arid and unforgiving, with each mile carrying the corpse of the woman who had died for their freedom, while buzzards and coyotes followed the scent of death like harbingers of their own mortality. Water became more precious than gold or diamonds, carefully rationed, drop by precious drop, and food was reduced to whatever they could catch or find growing wild among the rocks and thorns. The constant weight of grief made every mile feel like 10, and the knowledge that White Raven had sacrificed her life for their happiness was a burden heavier than any physical load they carried. On the 4th night of their funeral march, they encountered a Comanche hunting party led by Chief Tall Elk himself, the war chief's face carved from granite as he looked upon White Raven's body, and then at the two people whose love had cost his sister her life. My sister's spirit cries out for justice. Tall Elk said in English, his voice heavy with grief that had hardened into something approaching hatred. Her blood demands payment from those who brought death to her door. Other warriors gathered around them in the firelight, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready for the violence that seemed inevitable. Clara felt the weight of their accusatory stares and understood with crystal clarity that they had finally run out of places to hide from the consequences of their choices. These were Nashoba's own people, and they blamed him. Blamed both of them for bringing the curse of the white world into their midst and destroying everything it touched like a plague that consumed both the innocent and the guilty without distinction. She chose to help us of her own free will, Nashoba said quietly, meeting his chief's eyes without flinching despite the death he could see reflected there. No one forced her hand or coerced her decision. She chose death because you brought this white woman's curse among us like a disease. One of the younger warriors snarled, his voice thick with pain and the need for someone to blame for losses that seemed to have no end. First, our village burns to ash, then our medicine woman dies in a white man's courtroom. How much more must we lose for the sake of your selfish heart? The debate that followed was conducted entirely in Comanche harsh voices, rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. But Clara could read its meaning in the warriors' angry gestures and Tall Elk's increasingly grim expression. She was the source of all their troubles, the white woman whose very presence had brought nothing but death and destruction to people who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world wanted her blood. The discussion raged for hours around their dying fire voices, rising in anger and falling in despair as they struggled to balance justice against mercy, vengeance against wisdom. Clara sat in silence throughout it all, understanding that her fate was being decided in a language she couldn't speak by people who had every right to hate her for the suffering she had brought into their lives. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky with the promise of another day of sorrow, Tall Elk spoke again in English, his words measured and final as the judgment of ancient gods who had grown weary of human folly. The council has reached its decision, he announced with the weight of absolute authority. You will take my sister's body to the sacred caves near the Rio Grande, where our people have honored their dead for more generations than the white man can count. There you will bury her with proper ceremony according to our ancient ways. Then you will go north beyond the white man's borders, where his laws cannot follow, and you will never return to Comanche lands as long as you draw breath. This is the only mercy we can afford to give, mercy bought with White Raven's blood and paid for with our own tears. And if we refuse this judgment, Nashoba asked, though they all knew he had no choice in the matter. Tall Elk's hand moved to the bone-handled knife at his belt, the gesture casual, but carrying unmistakable threat. Then you will join her in death tonight, and your spirits can find their own way to the hunting grounds beyond the stars. They rode out at dawn with an escort of 6 warriors who made it clear through their silence and hostile glances that they were guards rather than companions, protectors of the sacred mission, rather than friends offering comfort in grief. The sacred caves lay hidden in a remote canyon near the Rio Grande, a place where Comanche medicine men had buried their honored dead for generations, beyond counting, where the spirits of the ancestors watched over their descendants from the world beyond the living. The funeral ceremony was both simple and profound, conducted according to traditions that stretched back to the very dawn of the Comanche people. White Raven's body was placed in a natural cave high in the canyon wall, surrounded by her medicine bundles and the tools of her healing trade, everything she would need for her journey to the spirit world, where pain and suffering were unknown. Clara added her own offering to the sacred burial, the blood-stained wedding dress she had worn on the night of the flood, finally letting go of the past that had brought so much suffering to so many innocent people. As she laid the white cotton fabric beside White Raven's still form, she whispered a promise that the old woman's sacrifice would not be in vain, that somehow love would triumph over the hatred that seemed to poison everything it touched. As earth and stones sealed the cave entrance forever, Nashoba sang a death song that seemed to echo from the canyon walls themselves, calling White Raven's spirit to its eternal rest, while asking the ancestors to forgive the choices that had led to this moment of unbearable loss. Clara didn't understand the words of the ancient chant, but she felt their meaning deep in her bones, grief transformed into acceptance, love made stronger by sacrifice, hope that could survive even in the shadow of death and betrayal. When the ceremony was finished and the last note of the death song had faded into silence, the Comanche warriors mounted their horses and rode away, without looking back, leaving Clara and Nashoba truly alone. For the first time since their paths had crossed in floodwater and desperation, they were exiles now from both their worlds, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terrible knowledge that love sometimes demanded a price too high for mortal hearts to bear willingly. But they were also free from pursuit, free from the hatred that had driven them across half the continent, free to build whatever life they could from the ashes of everything they had lost. They crossed the Rio Grande at a shallow ford near Santa Elena, their horses slipping and splashing through water that marked the boundary between one kind of hell and another. Mexico offered freedom from American law and the promise of a fresh start, but it also meant beginning again with nothing in a land where they would always be strangers, always be outsiders looking for a place to belong. The high desert of Chihuahua tested them in ways that human pursuit never could, subjecting them to extremes of heat and cold, thirst and exhaustion that pushed their bodies and spirits to the very limits of endurance. Waterholes were days apart across the scorching wasteland, and some proved to be nothing but alkali poison that could kill a horse in hours and leave human travelers writhing in agony until death finally claimed them. They ate whatever they could find, cactus fruit that provided both moisture and nourishment, small desert animals that Nashoba could catch in snares made from their bootlaces, roots and berries that Clara's knowledge of healing herbs told her were safe for human consumption. They slept in whatever shade they could find during the blazing heat of day, traveled by the light of moon and stars when the desert cooled enough to make movement bearable. Clara's hands, soft from weeks of recovery in the Comanche village, quickly blistered and hardened again under the brutal conditions. Her fair skin burned, despite the protection of White Raven's shawl, turning first red, then brown, then leather tough from constant exposure to the merciless sun. Her lips cracked until every word was painful, and her eyes watered constantly from the glare of sunlight reflected off sand and stone. But she endured every hardship without complaint, understanding that survival was a choice they had to make fresh each morning, a commitment renewed with every step across the endless wasteland. They had chosen each other and chosen love over safety, and now they had to live with the consequences of that choice, no matter how difficult the path ahead might prove to be. On their 10th day in Mexico, they finally crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below, like a beacon of hope in their desert wilderness. As they rode closer on horses that stumbled with exhaustion, they discovered a small settlement, a collection of adobe houses surrounding a central well with fields of corn and beans stretching toward the distant mountains like green promises of life and growth. The villagers were wary at first, as people learn to be when strangers appear on the horizon, carrying nothing but trouble and sorrow. But an old woman named Esperanza stepped forward from the group, her weathered face showing the kind of wisdom that comes only from a lifetime of seeing every variety of human suffering and triumph. She recognized the haunted look in Clara and Nashoba's eyes, the particular exhaustion that comes not just from physical hardship, but from running for their lives across impossible distances. She had seen refugees before, people fleeing violence, poverty, persecution, and every other cruelty that human beings could devise for tormenting their fellow creatures. "Stay as long as you need to heal," she said in Spanish, which Clara had learned from her mother during the long winter evenings of her childhood. "But understand that trouble follows some people like shadows follow the sun. We cannot protect you if your enemies come calling with guns and hate in their hearts." For 2 blessed weeks they rested in the village of San Miguel de las Flores, finding a peace they had almost forgotten could exist in a world that seemed designed for conflict and suffering. Clara helped the women with their weaving and cooking, her knowledge of healing herbs, making her welcome among people who understood the value of such skills in a place where the nearest doctor was hundreds of miles away. Nashoba worked alongside the men, repairing adobe walls damaged by the previous winter's storms and digging new irrigation ditches to bring precious water to their crops. His strength and steady presence earned their grudging respect, and his willingness to share what he knew about tracking and hunting made him valuable to their small community. It was good work, honest work, the kind that made them both dream of a life beyond running and hiding, beyond the constant fear that had become their closest companion. For brief moments, they could almost forget the violence and loss that had brought them to this place, could almost imagine growing old together in this peaceful valley where the only sounds were children's laughter and the gentle murmur of water flowing through irrigation channels. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford indefinitely, and both of them knew their respite couldn't last forever. On their 15th night in the village, riders appeared on the southern horizon, dark shapes silhouetted against the setting sun like harbingers of the apocalypse, moving with the methodical patience of professional hunters who had followed their trail across hundreds of miles of desert wasteland. Even at a distance, Clara recognized something in their approach that made her blood run cold as winter wind. These weren't local bandits or opportunistic criminals. These were the remaining members of Slade's gang, survivors of the Fort Dawson bloodbath, who had sworn to finish what their dead leader had started. Some of Slade's men survived, she whispered to Nashoba as they watched the riders from concealment behind the village church. "They're still tracking us, still trying to collect that bounty, even though Slade is dead and the charges have been dropped." Esperanza appeared at their sides, as if summoned by their fear, her weathered face grave with understanding born of hard experience, and too many years of watching good people suffer for the crimes of evil ones. "There is an old trail through the mountains," she said quietly, pointing toward peaks that rose like jagged teeth against the darkening sky. "It leads to the Pacific coast, to places where questions are never asked. And the past can be buried as deep as a person chooses to bury it. My grandson Miguel knows the way he can guide you as far as the first mountain pass, where the trail branches toward different destinations." They left the village before dawn, following Miguel up a path that wound through rocky canyons and pine forests that reminded Clara painfully of her childhood home in East Texas. The boy was 16 years old, with his grandmother's kind eyes and his grandfather's steady hands, and he led them through country that would have been impossible to navigate without a knowledgeable guide. On the second day of their mountain journey, they heard gunshots echoing from the valley behind them, distant pops that bounced off canyon walls like deadly thunder, each shot representing another innocent life destroyed by the violence that seemed to follow Clara and Nashoba wherever they went. Miguel's young face went pale as he realized what those sounds meant. and Clara felt sick with guilt and rage that burned in her chest like acid. Once again, innocent people were paying the price for her very existence, for her refusal to simply accept the fate that men like Marcus Voss and Harlan Slade had chosen for her. They found the village, Miguel said simply, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding far beyond his years. How many more would die before this nightmare finally ended? How much blood would stain Clara's hands before she found the peace that seemed to slip away like water through her fingers every time she thought she'd finally grasped it? The questions tormented her as they pushed their exhausted horses harder up the steep mountain trails, climbing through passes where the air grew thin and cold, despite the desert heat they'd left behind in the valleys below. Miguel left them at a high mountain pass, where 3 different trails converged like the fingers of fate, pointing toward uncertain destinies. He gestured toward a distant smudge of blue that marked the Pacific Ocean, barely visible through the haze of distance and atmospheric distortion. "Follow the middle path," he said, his voice steady despite the fear she could see in his dark eyes. "It will take you to Puerto Esperanza, where ships come and go without customs officers asking uncomfortable questions about passengers' true identities. Tell them that Esperanza from San Miguel sent you, and they will help you find passage to wherever you wish to go." But they never reached Puerto Esperanza or the promise of escape it represented. On their 3rd day alone in the high mountains, with Miguel already far behind them and safety still days ahead, Clara's horse stepped wrong on loose shale and went down hard with a sound like breaking kindling. The animal's scream of pain echoed from the peaks like a banshee's wail, and Nashoba's face was grim as a carved stone as he drew his knife to perform the mercy that only death could provide. The horse's leg was shattered beyond any hope of healing, and leaving it to suffer would have been cruelty beyond forgiveness. "We walk from here," he said simply after ending the poor beast's agony with a quick, clean thrust to the heart. 2 days to the coast, if we push hard and the weather holds. 3 days if we have to take shelter from storms." They took what supplies they could carry on their backs and left the rest beside the dead horse for scavengers to find and claim. The trail ahead was narrow and treacherous, winding along cliff faces, where a single misstep would mean a 1,000-foot fall to the jagged rocks below that waited like hungry teeth to devour the unwary. Clara's legs trembled with exhaustion as they climbed higher into the thin mountain air, and her lungs burned with each labored breath as oxygen became scarce as hope itself. But she forced herself to keep moving through sheer stubborn will, understanding that stopping now would mean death for both of them. On the 2nd day of their desperate flight on foot, they heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats on the trail behind them, and the rhythmic thunder of pursuit that had haunted their dreams for what felt like lifetimes. Their enemies had horses, while they had only their feet and their determination. And the gap between hunter and hunted was closing with each passing hour, like a noose tightening around condemned necks. By evening, they could actually see their pursuers silhouetted against the sky, 3 riders who had survived the carnage at Fort Dawson and the massacre at San Miguel. Men whose dedication to collecting bounty money exceeded their concern for law justice or human decency. That night, huddled together in a cave, barely large enough for 2 people, Clara and Nashoba faced the truth they had been avoiding for too long. "We can't keep running forever," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness that pressed around them like a burial shroud. "They'll never stop hunting us, never give up the chase, and we'll never be safe anywhere as long as we remain who we are." Nashoba was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire they had risked building for warmth, despite the danger of its light being seen by their pursuers. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of desperate inspiration born from utter hopelessness. "There is one more option," he said finally, pulling something from his shirt, a document they had managed to save from the chaos at Fort Dawson, legal proof of their marriage, that represented the only official acknowledgement of their love that the world had ever granted them. "We become ghosts, We die here in these mountains and leave our names behind forever, like shed snakeskins. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it represented their only remaining chance for genuine freedom. They would stage their own deaths, making it look as though they had fallen from the cliffs during a desperate escape attempt. If their pursuers found convincing evidence of their demise, perhaps the hunting would finally stop, and they could begin new lives with new names in a place where no one would think to look for dead people. They spent the next morning preparing their deception with the meticulous care of people whose lives depended on getting every detail exactly right. Clara's torn skirt was scattered near the edge of a particularly treacherous cliff, along with strands of her distinctive blonde hair that they carefully placed on sharp rocks where they would be easily discovered. Nashoba's knife and one of his moccasins were positioned at strategic points along what appeared to be a failed attempt to climb down the cliff face, and they used blood from a rabbit that Nashoba had managed to snare during the night to create convincing stains on the stones that would tell a story of desperation and ultimate failure. The hardest part was destroying their marriage certificate and the few other personal items they had managed to save from their various ordeals. White Raven's medicine pouch, a letter from Father Miguel expressing his regrets for his betrayal, and the turquoise necklace that was all they had left of their wedding day happiness. Clara watched the papers turn to ash in their small fire, with tears streaming down her face. Understanding that she was witnessing the death of Clara Bell White Wolf and the birth of someone entirely new, someone with no past and no connections to the violence that had followed them across half a continent. When their pursuers finally caught up with them late that afternoon, Clara and Nashoba were hidden deep within a cave system that Miguel had told them about, a network of natural tunnels that honeycombed the mountain like the burrows of some enormous underground creature. They listened in breathless silence as boots clattered on stone above their heads, as voices called out in triumph at discovering the evidence of their quarry's apparent demise. Looks like they tried to climb down the cliff face when they realized we had them cornered. One man said, his voice echoing strangely in the thin mountain air. Probably fell about 300 feet onto those rocks down there. Coyotes and buzzards will have scattered whatever's left of the bones by now. You're good enough for me. Another voice replied with grim satisfaction that spoke of a job finally completed. No point in chasing dead people for bounty money that ain't never gonna get paid anyway. Let's head back to civilization and find ourselves some living criminals to hunt. They waited in the caves for 3 full days, eating nothing but the bitter water that seeped from limestone walls and a few questionable mushrooms that might or might not have been safe for human consumption. When they finally emerged into sunlight that seemed bright as hope itself, the trail was empty in both directions, and the only sounds were wind sighing through pine trees and the distant cry of eagles riding thermals high above the peaks. But their ordeal was far from over. They still had to reach the Pacific coast, still had to find passage to somewhere safe, still had to build entirely new lives from the ashes of their old identities. And they had to accomplish all of this without using their real names or acknowledging their past in any way that might connect them to the violence they were leaving behind. The journey to Puerto Esperanza took 6 more grueling days through country that grew steadily more tropical and humid as they descended towards sea level. They encountered other travelers along the way, merchants, pilgrims, refugees like themselves, fleeing various forms of persecution. But they kept to themselves, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and never volunteering information about their origins or their ultimate destinations. The port town was exactly what Miguel had promised, a place where questions weren't asked, and official papers could be arranged for the right price, no matter how irregular the circumstances might be. Clara sold White Raven's silver bracelet to a gem merchant who asked no questions about how she had acquired such a valuable piece of Native American jewelry, hating herself for the transaction, but needing the money more than she needed the memories it represented. The ship they eventually boarded was bound for California, where gold fever continued to draw thousands of people seeking new beginnings and second chances in a land where the past mattered less than a person's willingness to work hard and mind their own business. Among so many strangers and dreamers, two more faces would attract no attention whatsoever, especially if those faces belonged to people who had never existed before this moment in time. They chose their new names during the 3-week voyage across waters that seemed to wash away their old selves with each passing wave. Maria Santos, for Clara Diego Rivera, for Nashoba, simple names that could belong to anyone that carried no weight of history or expectation or blood-soaked tragedy. They practiced their new identities and rehearsed their story of being political refugees from Mexico until it became more real than their actual past, until their former selves seemed like characters from someone else's tragic story. California in 1851 was a land of infinite possibility and constant chaos, where fortunes were made and lost daily in gold fields and gambling halls, and where a person's past mattered infinitely less than their willingness to work hard and contribute to the rough communities springing up around mining camps and trading posts. They settled in a small valley north of San Francisco, where Diego's skills as a tracker and hunter were highly valued by homesteaders struggling to protect their livestock from predators, and where Maria's extensive knowledge of healing herbs made her indispensable to scattered families who had no access to trained doctors or modern medicine. They built a cabin of redwood logs and fieldstone beside a creek that reminded them both of happier times. Though they never spoke those memories aloud, for fear of awakening the ghosts they had worked so hard to bury. Diego hunted deer and elk in the surrounding forests, trading meat and hides for supplies and equipment, while Maria grew vegetables and medicinal plants in a garden that became the envy of every woman in the valley. More importantly, she established herself as the area's primary healer, treating everything from broken bones and infected wounds to difficult childbirths and mysterious fevers, with a combination of frontier medicine and Comanche healing traditions that proved remarkably effective in saving lives and alleviating suffering. They were respected members of their small community, known throughout the region for their kindness to strangers in need and their willingness to help neighbors without expecting payment in return. Their reputation for generosity and skill spread far beyond their own valley, and people traveled for days just to seek Maria's healing touch or Diego's expertise in tracking dangerous animals. The years passed peacefully each season, blending into the next in a rhythm of honest work and quiet contentment that they had never imagined possible during their desperate flight across the continent. They aged together in their mountain valley, like two trees growing side by side, their love deepening with each passing year, like fine wine maturing in oak barrels. Their hair turned gray at the temples, and their faces acquired the lines and weathering that spoke of decades spent under the open sky. But their devotion to each other never wavered or diminished. If anything, their shared trials had forged a bond between them that was stronger than the mountains themselves, unbreakable as the love that had sustained them through every hardship and tragedy. But the past has a way of demanding recognition even when people think they have successfully escaped its influence. And their reckoning came 5 years after they had settled into their new lives as Maria and Diego Rivera. The visitor arrived on a spring morning when wildflowers carpeted their valley floor like a multicolored quilt, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. Joseph Standing Bear was a young man in his early 20s, with familiar features that made Clara's heart skip a beat, despite the fact that she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. "I'm looking for my grandmother," he said in careful English that carried only the slightest accent. Her name was White Raven, and she died 5 years ago helping a white woman and a Comanche warrior escape from Texas. "I believe you knew her." Clara's hands trembled as she set down the laundry she had been hanging on the line to dry in the mountain sunshine. Beside her, Diego's face went very still, in the way it always did when danger approached their peaceful existence, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name," Clara said carefully, though her heart was racing like a trapped bird beating its wings against the bars of a cage. Joseph, standing bare, smiled sadly, as if he had expected exactly this response, and wasn't surprised by their caution. "My grandmother told me you might say that. She also told me that if I ever found you, I should give you this as proof of who I am and why I've come such a long way to speak with you." From inside his shirt, he pulled a beaded medicine bag that Clara recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed since she had last seen it. The bag had belonged to White Raven, and inside it was a lock of Clara's own hair, saved from their wedding day as a token of hope and new beginnings that now seemed like they had happened in another lifetime to entirely different people. "She wanted you to know." Joseph continued quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a message that had been entrusted to him by a dying woman, "that the Comanche people have not forgotten your kindness or her sacrifice. And she wanted me to tell you that it's time to stop running from shadows that can no longer hurt you." The conversation that followed lasted until the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Clara of the wedding dress she had worn so many years ago. Joseph told them about the dramatic changes that had swept through Comanche territory in the years since their exile. The increasing pressure from white settlers hungry for land, and the dwindling buffalo herds that had sustained his people for countless generations, and the young warriors who spoke of resistance, while the old chiefs counseled acceptance of an inevitable and tragic future. "Chief Tall Elk is dead," Joseph said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of loss that never seemed to diminish no matter how much time passed. "He was killed in a cavalry raid 2 winters ago, along with most of the other war chiefs who remembered the old ways. Before he died, he spoke of you, both of you. He said that perhaps exile had not been punishment, but protection, that the spirits had kept you safe for reasons that none of us could understand at the time." Clara looked at Diego, seeing her own thoughts and emotions reflected in his dark eyes that had seen so much suffering, and yet still held the capacity for hope. They had built a genuinely good life in California, but it was a life founded on lies and false identities, on the deliberate burial of their true selves beneath layers of deception that had become so thick they sometimes forgot who they really were underneath it all. Perhaps it was finally time to acknowledge the truth, not to the world, which would never understand or forgive, but to themselves, and to the memory of the woman who had died to make their freedom possible. "What do you want from us?" Diego asked, his voice carefully neutral, but carrying undertones of the wariness that had kept them alive through so many years of danger. Joseph was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the western hills, where eagles circled in lazy spirals high above the valley floor. "My people are dying," he said finally, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and despair. "Not from bullets or disease, though those take their toll as well, but from forgetting who we are. The old ways are being lost like sand through our fingers, the old stories forgotten by children who speak only English and dream only of white man's gold." He paused, gathering his thoughts, before continuing, with the careful precision of someone delivering a message that had been entrusted to him by spirits as well as by the living. "My grandmother believed that you two carry medicine, the power to show that different peoples can live together without destroying each other, that love can be stronger than the hatred that seems to poison everything it touches. She wanted me to find you and ask you to witness what may be the last great gathering of our people." Clara felt something stirring in her chest, a mixture of hope and terror that reminded her of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the only way forward was to jump and trust that somehow she would survive the fall. "We're not symbols or prophets," she said firmly. "We're just two people who wanted to survive and found each other in the darkness. Sometimes that's the most powerful symbol of all." Joseph replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. Joseph stayed with them for 3 days, sharing news from the world they had left behind and helping them understand how dramatically everything had changed in their absence. Marcus Voss had died in prison 2 years earlier, killed by another inmate who had taken exception to wife-beaters on general principle. The corrupt sheriff from Fort Dawson had been removed from office and run out of town by angry citizens who had finally learned the full truth about his dealings with bounty hunters and criminals. Most importantly, the remaining members of Slade's gang had been systematically hunted down by federal marshals operating under direct orders from Washington. Their reign of terror finally ended by the very law they had mocked and corrupted for so long. On his last morning with them, Joseph made an unexpected request that would change the course of their lives once again. "Come back with me," he said simply. "Not to stay, but to witness. There's going to be a great peace council at Medicine Lodge Creek chiefs from all the Plains tribes meeting with government officials to discuss the future of our peoples. Your presence there together might remind everyone that peace is possible, even when it seems like an impossible dream." Clara and Diego looked at each other across their breakfast table, and something passed between them that needed no words to be understood completely. They had been Maria Santos and Diego Rivera for 5 years, living quiet lives built on the foundation of other people's deaths and their own deliberate forgetfulness. Perhaps it was finally time for Clara Bell and Nashoba to have their say in the world's affairs, to step out of the shadows and prove that love could indeed triumph over hatred if people were brave enough to choose it over the easier path of prejudice and violence. The journey back to the Great Plains took 6 weeks, following trails that carried them through landscapes both familiar and strange, each mile bringing back memories they had tried so hard to bury beneath their new identities. The California goldfields gave way to Nevada's harsh deserts, then to Colorado's snow-capped peaks, and finally to the endless grasslands, where buffalo herds still darkened the horizon like moving storms that spoke of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing forever. The Peace Council at Medicine Lodge Creek was unlike anything Clara had ever seen or imagined possible. Thousands of Indians from dozens of different tribes had gathered for the negotiations: Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others whose names she didn't recognize, but whose faces told the same story of loss and desperate hope for a better future. Government officials had come with wagon trains full of supplies and treaty documents covered with promises that everyone knew would be broken within months, while newspaper reporters scribbled notes for readers back east who would never understand what they were witnessing: the end of an entire way of life, the death of freedom itself. Clara and Nashoba, for they had reclaimed their true names for this journey into their own past, stayed on the edges of the great gathering, observers rather than participants in the formal negotiations. But their presence was noticed, and stories began spreading through the camps like wildfire: the white woman who had married a Comanche warrior, who had chosen love over law, and paid the ultimate price for crossing the lines that divided their worlds. On the 4th day of the council, Chief Ten Bears of the Comanche asked to speak with them privately. The old war chief was nearly 70 years old, his face lined with the accumulated weight of countless battles and impossible decisions. But his eyes still burned with the fire of a man who had never learned to surrender his dignity to anyone or anything. "I knew White Raven well," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned to lie or dissemble. "She spoke of you often in her final years, said that you carried hope for a future that none of us could see clearly, but all of us needed to believe in. We're not prophets or messengers from the spirit world," Nashoba replied with characteristic directness. "We're just people who refused to hate each other when the world expected us to, who chose love over the easier path of bitterness and revenge." Ten Bears smiled, his weathered features softening with something that might have been approval or recognition of a truth he had long suspected but never had confirmed. "Sometimes that's prophecy enough for any world," he said quietly. The Peace Council ended with treaties that would be violated before the ink was dry on the parchment, promises that would prove as empty as the wind that blew endlessly across the plains. But for Clara and Nashoba, it marked the end of their long exile from themselves and their own truth. They had faced their past without flinching, acknowledged their choices without shame or regret, and discovered that the world had moved on while they had been learning how to live authentic lives built on love rather than hatred. They returned to California with lighter hearts, but not to stay in the valley that had sheltered them for 5 years. The mountains that had once seemed protective now felt confining, like prison walls that kept them separated from the larger world where their story might serve as an example to others struggling with the same choices between love and hatred that had once nearly destroyed them. They sold their cabin and their land to a young couple from Oregon who were seeking the same kind of peace and anonymity that Clara and Nashoba had found there. After saying goodbye to neighbors who had known them as Maria and Diego, they loaded their few possessions onto a wagon and headed south toward Mexico once again. Not as fugitives this time, but as free people choosing their own destiny. They settled in a coastal town in Baja California, where the desert met the Pacific Ocean and where the sunsets painted the sky in colors that seemed to have no names in any human language. It was a place where the past could coexist peacefully with the present, where different cultures blended together without losing their essential character. Nashoba returned to using his birth name and opened a small school where he taught local children to read and write in both Spanish and English, sharing the stories his grandmother had told him alongside lessons in arithmetic and geography that would help them navigate an increasingly complex world. Clara established a clinic where she treated injuries and illnesses with a unique combination of frontier medicine and traditional Comanche healing practices, her reputation for compassion and skill spreading throughout the region like ripples on still water. More importantly, she began taking in refugees, people fleeing violence, persecution, and poverty, who needed a safe place to heal and start over. They were happy in the way that people can be happy when they stop fighting against fate and start working with it instead, when they discover that their greatest trials have prepared them to help others facing similar challenges. They grew old together in their house by the sea, their love deepening with each passing year. Like wine aging in oak barrels, their shared memories becoming the foundation for a contentment neither had thought possible during their years of running and hiding. Clara and Nashoba became legends in their own small way, known throughout Baja California as the couple who had defied the world for love and won. Visitors came from hundreds of miles away, traders, travelers, and occasionally someone who had heard their story and wanted to meet the people who had proven that mercy could indeed be stronger than law, that love could triumph over hatred if people were brave enough to choose it. They received all visitors with quiet courtesy and generous hospitality, neither confirming nor denying, passing the tales that had grown around their names, like flowers blooming in previously barren soil. They had learned that some stories were too important to belong to the people who had lived them, that their greatest gift to the world was not the details of their suffering, but the proof that such suffering could be transformed into something beautiful and life-giving. On Clara's 60th birthday, as they sat on their porch watching waves roll endlessly toward the shore, like the rhythm of God's own breathing, she asked the question that had been weighing on her heart for years. Do you ever regret any of it? The choices we made, the prices we paid the people who died because of us. Nashoba was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he hadn't heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of all their shared years, all the joy and sorrow they had witnessed and endured together. I regret the pain we caused others, he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that some truths could only be spoken once. I regret that White Raven died for our choices, that innocent people suffered because we dared to love each other across the lines that the world had drawn in blood and hatred. I regret that we had to become different people to find peace. He paused, reaching for her hand, with fingers that were still strong, despite their age, still capable of the tenderness that had first won her heart in a Comanche shelter so many years ago. But I don't regret choosing you, he continued. I don't regret the love we found in the middle of hate and chaos. And I don't regret proving that mercy can be stronger than law, that hope can survive even in the darkest places, that two people willing to sacrifice everything for each other can change the world in ways that armies and governments never could. Clara squeezed his fingers, feeling the calluses that spoke of decades of honest work and the warmth that had never faded, despite everything they had endured together. "Then we've lived a good life," she said simply. "The best life," he agreed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They died within hours of each other, 23 years later, as if their spirits had grown so intertwined over the decades that separation had become impossible. Clara went first, slipping away peacefully in her sleep on a warm spring morning, while Nashoba held her hand and whispered the same Comanche love songs he had sung to her on their wedding night beside the river where they had first chosen each other. He followed her that same evening, his heart simply stopping as the sun touched the western horizon like a benediction from the God they had served, not through words, but through the way they had lived their lives together. The people of their adopted town buried them together in a hilltop cemetery overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and their graves marked with simple wooden crosses bearing the names they had chosen for themselves, Maria Santos Rivera and Diego Rivera Santos. But the epitaph carved below told their real story in words that would outlast the wood and stone. They chose love, and love chose them. Their house by the sea remained a refuge for years after their deaths, maintained by grateful people whose lives they had touched and changed. The clinic continued to operate under the guidance of a young woman Clara had trained, and the school kept teaching children in both languages according to the methods Nashoba had developed. More importantly, their example lived on in every person who chose compassion over cruelty, understanding over ignorance, love over the easier path of hatred and prejudice. They had shown an entire region that the most revolutionary act was sometimes the simplest, seeing the humanity in someone the world had declared inhuman, and choosing to honor that recognition regardless of the cost. In the end, Clara and Nashoba had found what they had been seeking all along: not safety from the world's hatred, but freedom from its power to poison their own hearts. They had learned to love without condition, to forgive without limit, and to hope without reservation in a world that seemed designed to crush such virtues. They had become the change they wished to see, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of mercy at a time. Their legacy was written not in history books or monuments, but in the lives of everyone who had witnessed their courage and been inspired to choose love over fear in their own struggles with a world that often seemed to reward hatred and punish kindness. The sun continued to set over the Pacific Ocean as it had every day for countless millennia, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have reminded Clara of her mother's wedding dress if wedding dresses could be made of light instead of cloth. And in that eternal dance between day and night, between earth and sky, between one human heart and another, the story of Clara Bell and Nashoba lived on, a testament to love's power to overcome any obstacle, to bridge any divide, to heal any wound that hatred might inflict upon the world. Their names were carved not only in stone, but in the memories of everyone who had known them, and everyone who had been touched by their quiet courage and unwavering commitment to each other, and to the principle that mercy was indeed the only magic left in a world that had forgotten how to love. They had lived and died as they had chosen to love completely fearlessly, and with a faith in the ultimate triumph of good over evil that transformed everyone who came into contact with their extraordinary, ordinary lives.